are kind of very influenced by the idea of kind of chaos control theory. After that, we started realizing that, recognizing the aspects of chaos, that there were these interesting systems that we now call complex adaptive systems that are very interesting in that they're somewhat self-aware. They have internal cycles kind of looking back, and these are things like economies, biological systems, ecological systems, civil systems, etc. This is a complex system, but it's not a complex adaptive system. When a gear breaks, it breaks and it stops working. This is a complex adaptive system, which is, pretty much represents a frog as well as an economy. These are systems with a lot of inherent density of feedback within the system. And in studying complex adaptive systems, we've noticed that there are a lot of different systems that kind of run the gamut from very disordered random systems down to very ordered, very predictable, fairly boring systems. The really interesting ones are the ones that are somewhere in between, right in that middle layer. These are basically also some of the chaotic systems tend to be the most interesting ones, and this is where you find a frog. This is where you find an economy, a city, etc. And so these are the systems that are the most interesting to simulate and probably the most useful in terms of us trying to understand them. One of the interesting things to me about simulation is that in some sense simulation has turned out to be an amazing tool for spotlighting our ignorance of a system. We'll try to simulate it. Our simulation will not match reality. We'll go back and look at the simulation and say, okay, why is our simulation not working? Oh, we're getting this wrong. The traffic generator's broken. Or the CO2, greenhouse effect thing is way off. And basically the simulation, the deficiencies in the simulation will spotlight our ignorance about the system in general and tell us where to go look and learn more. So that's one of the, when we're trying to predict and simulate these complex systems, most of these are fairly unpredictable beyond some point in time. So trying to predict, what's going to happen with the economy or, how my city is going to unfold over the next 20 years are fairly, in some sense, kind of like fool's errands in my mind. But in terms of understanding, what do we need to learn more about in this system, simulations are excellent. Network theory is much more recent. With the rise of the internet, people got very interested in kind of the idea of network theory. The internet was the first prime example, but then people started realizing that you can look at almost anything as an internet. Social networks that we're probably all familiar with are, could be mapped this way, me and all my friends. Metabolic systems, the way kind of proteins and things move through a cell can be mapped this way. Economies can be mapped this way. And they found that no matter what system you're looking at, that they all had some very interesting properties in common. One of them is what's known as the power law distribution. If you look at web pages out on the net, how many links are pointing to each web page, you're going to have a few, like Google, Yahoo, etc., that have a huge number of links coming into them. Most of them, have very few. But in fact, you get a characteristic curve like this. You can look at topics on the internet. You're going to find a few topics that have, a huge amount of hits on any search. Some that have kind of a medium amount, and some that are way down this long tail. Now we could just as well be mapping protein interactions in a cell here, or economic transactions across the globe, and we would still get this characteristic distribution, and it's the power law distribution. There was another interesting kind of lesson that came out of network theory, the idea of connectedness. When you take individual agents and you start connecting them at random, how many connections do you have to make before you have a fully connected system? And the kind of counterintuitive result here is that on average, if you have one link per agent, at that point you will have a fully connected graph, no matter how large the graph is. It doesn't matter if we're dealing with 7 little dots here or 7 million. As soon as we have an average of one link per dot, it's going to be a fully connected graph. And a side result of this is what is the graph width of this graph? In other words, how many steps does it take to get from one point in this graph to another? And again, almost scale independent. It doesn't matter whether I have 7 dots here or 7 million. It's almost never more than 6 links to get from one spot to another. Hence ensuring the immortality of Kevin Bacon, I'm sure. So in some sense, as a designer, I see this kind of as my toolbox for simulation design. In some sense, the topologies represent the nouns. How do I break my system down into structure? The dynamics, really are the verbs of the system. How is this changing over time? And the paradigms really are the grammar. What is the language in which I'm deconstructing? And then I'm able to regenerate the system in an abstract simulation for the player to come in and kind of interactively play with. Now, players are going to approach this stuff, no matter how complex it is. We have this amazing kind of pattern ability, pattern matching, pattern sensing ability. How many of you see a dog in this picture? It's just kind of amazing when you think of the information content in this picture that you can extract a dog from it. How many of you see a dog in this picture? Well, we tend to see patterns in places even when patterns don't exist. We have this amazingly almost hyperactive pattern matching mechanism in our brain that's always trying to map patterns on almost anything. In some sense, the end result of these pattern matching algorithms are what we call schema. And this is the idea that we can abstract from large sets of data around the world into rules that we can then reapply to other situations that aren't exactly the same, but they're pretty close. And they're fairly flexible rules. When you think about going to a restaurant, there are all these things that you kind of expect maybe might occur when you go to a restaurant. And this is based upon you going to hundreds or thousands of restaurants over your life. That not every restaurant is going to have every one of these steps, but overall, this is a fairly good kind of rule set for what to expect to happen when you go to a restaurant. So you kind of built this fairly elaborate schema of that activity based upon your experience. Really, it's a way to predict the causality of situations based upon large numbers of pre-examples. A lot of storytelling really is kind of based upon the idea of the schema. That we have repeated patterns now that we think of as like cliches in stories or archetypal things that we bring to bear, that we actually extract from stories and can reapply to later life. It's interesting when these schema go awry though, and we're even aware of it in a lot of cases and not aware of it in others. In a Hollywood movie, whenever a car crashes, of course it blows up, right? And in reality that doesn't really happen. But we kind of take that as a given. We kind of understand that that's Hollywood, that's not reality. I saw the last Indiana Jones movie, and it was amazing how these people were having machine gun fights for like 15 minutes straight, and not one person was ever hit by a bullet. And I really don't think guns are that safe. One of my favorite examples was, from the James Bond movies, there's always this idea of, the evil villain. And the evil villain always has the super lair, right? You can't be an evil villain without this elaborate evil lair. And back after 9/11, they started looking for bin Laden, and everybody was writing about, how he was holed up in the mountains of Afghanistan. And the New York Times published this picture of his mountain fortress. And I don't know if it was this some, imaginative writer that wrote this, but at some point the Defense Department was basically referring to this, confirming it. Oh yeah, he's got this giant fortress with hydroelectric power and operating rooms and all this stuff. And I think everybody had been so conditioned to the idea that if you're an evil villain, you have to have this elaborate evil lair, that it was just amazing to me. And of course they got into the mountains, and it was a couple little rat holes with some AK-47s in the back is all they found. But so sometimes these schema can really kind of lead us astray. Now, these models that we're building from the schema, these are higher level constructs that we kind of collect the schema together to build. And when you think about it, when a kid is playing a computer game or video game, in some sense they're really exhibiting the scientific method. They sit there, they pick up the controller, they start interacting with it, they study the results, they build a model in their head, based upon what they see happening, they refine that model over time. And they do this naturally. Nobody's teaching them, here's how you do the scientific method. This is naturally the way they approach it. Basically their agency interacting with the causal model building in their head leads them to apply the scientific method to master the game. In some sense, science really is just, how do you take a lot of data, abstract that out into rules that you can use to then recreate and predict that data. In some sense, game designers do kind of the opposite. A game designer is really trying to find what's the most succinct set of rules that we can build in the simulation that will lead, to the widest variety of situations, possibilities that we can now present to the player as the player moves around in the game. So really, the player is engaged in this model building. As they play the game, what they're really doing is they're reverse engineering your simulation, your model that you put in front of them. In some sense, as a game designer, you have to realize that that's the real model that you're having to build. The model in the player's head, not the model in the computer. The model in the computer really is just a compiler for the eventual real model. The real model you want is the model in the player's imagination. And that model you're building on the computer is basically having to bootstrap that player's model up to whatever level you want. Now, in some sense, so the player is confronted with this black box that they're interacting with. And they can't just kind of jump into this elaborate model. You can't just kind of drop a complex model into their head right off the bat. In some sense, you have to ramp the model over time. And you have to think about how are they going to start with a very simple model of the system, and then slowly, over time, ramp it to higher and higher levels of complexity. You want them to be able to layer on the complexity and be able to play the game with a very simple model of the way it works. Kill the Nazis or whatever it is. But over time, add in more and more subtle dynamics to the game. So they get some, basically, a running start.